as I began to look more and more at what the actual early church fathers wrote, whether it was from Clement or Ignatius or Justin or whomever, the more you look, the more you begin to become uncomfortable as a Presbyterian. And if you love Jesus, that's a very difficult thing, because everything is supposed to be in sync in Jesus's religion. What's going on? So what I ended up with was a growing dichotomy, a growing split for me between what I had grown up believing to be true, namely that the sole authority for my theology is the Bible, and my way to salvation and to perfection, so to speak, is through faith alone in Jesus Christ. And in fact, to be honest with you, I don't become perfect. Jesus vouches for me to declare me perfect. As Luther says, he covers you, so to speak. No real transformation of soul, but a transformation of the will. You become more pliant to Christ, but you don't actually change. As Luther would say, you're still a reprobate. And here what I'm reading in the early church fathers is that no, you must actually change. That the Eucharist is really the body and blood of Christ. If you read Ignatius, the more that you read Ignatius, the more you begin to see over and over and over again that the Eucharist is something mystical. He talks about it as the antidote to mortality. That's not Presbyterian. That's not Calvinist. That's not Lutheran. What's more, the more you read that, you begin to see something else show up as well. This is a bishop-based church. It's a communicating bishop-based church.
In the early church, you mean?
In the early church, yes, yeah. So just take a look at the Bible and just look at that for a moment as a series of documents from the early church. You've got Paul writing from one church to another from across the Mediterranean. You've got letters from James, from John, from Jude. You've got letters from Peter. You've got letters in the New Testament that demonstrate these people were keeping in touch with the people that they were involved with, and they were aware of the ministries of the other people, too. Now, there were other letters that didn't make it into the New Testament, but were other letters. Barnabas out there, an apostle, we have his. We have the apostle, the third bishop of Rome, Clement. 2 letters ascribed to him, one of them genuine, that all scholars, Protestant and Catholic, agree is genuine. Written probably somewhere between the late 70s and the mid-90s of that first century. Writing again as the Bishop of Rome to another church, talking about bishops and their authority. And then you get to Ignatius, and he's this Bishop of Antioch, trained by one of the apostles. You'd think he'd know what they taught. And he's now voluntarily going over to his death. What he knows is his martyrdom. And he writes these series of letters, of which we've got 7. They're addressed to bishops. And what is he talking there? He talks about the authority of bishops. He talks about the authority of the Eucharist, and that Eucharist is only valid when it's celebrated in union with the bishop. Valid for what? I was taught it's about the priesthood of all believers. What's that about? So that I began to really experience a division in what I was taught to be true versus what I was experiencing in the history that I was studying.
At what point in there did you discover that this wasn't just not Presbyterian, but this was pulling you in the direction of Rome?
Well, I had a couple of things that happened. I had a friend who really prodded me quite a bit and got me involved with some Catholics and challenged me to really reflect on why I believed what I believed. I believed that the Bible alone was all that was needed. We're backing up now a little bit from where I ended up, and as part of that, I had already begun thinking some of these thoughts, but this person came along right at the right time to ask some of these questions, and then linked me up with some people that were very important. A Father Kozina out of St. Margaret Mary's in Oakland. I was introduced to him. I didn't know at the time, but I was being introduced to the person who was the only person in the Oakland area to have the indult to be able to do the Latin Masses, both the Novus Ordo and the Trinitine. And he was a Slovenian. He kind of talked like this, kind of like Boris Karloff. And I came into the first time to listen to him preach. I actually came and I kind of snuck in the back with this friend of mine. And when he got to his sermon, he preached on hell. He kind of preached like hell, that's really loud type. a Catholic teaching on hell. I had been to other Catholic sermons. I hadn't heard anyone really teach on hell before. It was one of the reasons why I kind of dismissed the Catholic Church, really, was they don't stand for anything. The experience that I'd had up to that point, anyway. So I was introduced to some people that began to allow me to explore. We go back to that same theme of needing to ask questions. I found a mentor in this Father Cosina. Mentor is the wrong term, but someone allowing me to explore. He was, I believe, in his 70s at the time. I remember the first time that I sat down with him for an appointment, and I was there at his coffee table, and I merely mentioned this Peter problem about what authority he had. And he says, "Excuse me for just a minute." And he then goes upstairs, and he comes down with this big stack of books, most of them are Greek. And he begins to start trying to show me, and of course, assuming that I know my Greek better than he does. And I'm sorry, I'm a modern seminary, and we don't know the Greek that well. And I did pretty well. But he was very patient and worked with me on where I was. But it really emerged to two issues. One of them had to do with Eucharist. And I would call that, frankly, the secondary issue for me. It was in the back of my mind because I was now beginning, I knew what transubstantiation was. I'd studied the history. I knew it intellectually. But I'd always dismissed it. So while I'm asking these questions, in the back of my mind, there's this, what if it is true? I remember going into a church once and hearing the bells, and then everyone kneeling, and I'm thinking, they all think that's God up there. And it hit me, what if it is? It sends that shiver down you when you begin to realize that. But that wasn't the major issue for me. I was too intellectually prideful, I think, to really listen as much to that as I needed to. It really was, if Peter was given authority, and you could tell just by reading Scripture, he was given some sort of authority. If that was the blank check that it seemed to be in Scripture, when did he lose it? And if he had that blank check and church history indicates that it was passed on, well, even Luther indicated it was passed on, but that the papacy lost it. Well, when? I'm studying early church history. Let's find out. So I remember debating, a friend of mine, debate's kind of a hard term to use, I don't think we were, and debate's a bad thing in my opinion anyway. It has to do with mental acuity more than the spirit. And anyway. But I remember thinking, this person, she was getting exasperated and finally said, well, prove it. I said, okay, I will. What do I have to prove? Well, you just said, I guess I had said, that if the Pope is indeed infallible, then God will protect the Pope from anything that is wrong when he's speaking as an infallible Pope from the chair of Peter, intending to bind the whole church. And I'll lay you dollars to donuts that I can show you a Pope that committed heresy. You got 265 of them. We got to find one. Jesus had 1 out of 12. We should be able to find at least 10%. So I began my search, and the more I began to look and look and look, the more dry I found it. I even went to the 800s and 900s where we have some really bad popes, morally speaking. I mean, to be honest about our own heritage, we have some very bad popes in there morally. But the more evil they acted, the more silent they were on theology. And that's where I was going. I finally turned to the experts. I went to the Protestants and the Orthodox and found out what they had to say. And what I found was they had identified 3. Vigilius, Honorius, and Liberius the first. Each of them the first. No one wanted to be the second, I guess. But and Vigilius and Liberius, both of them were shown to really have been, they had fallen because of politics more than anything else. But Honorius, there we had someone. There I thought, I could smell the smoke from here. He supposedly taught about a heresy, or taught from the chair of Peter a heresy, in letters he had written to Sergius, which he was an Eastern bishop. And he was talking about monothelitism, a very fancy M word for there being one will. And we know there's 2 wills to Jesus, his human will and his divine will. So, if this seemed to be fairly simple, all we'd need to do is to find the evidence where he taught this, and we're done. So I went to the library and I found the 2 letters that were extant. They were, of course, written in Greek, and I'm not a fool, I can't read Greek that well. There was a facing copy of German, and I don't do German. But Father Cosina, I figured, would. He was from Slovenia, and of course he didn't either. But he had someone who did. So God bless them. We had a couple of people who translated the German of these letters into English so I could look at these, find the Greek section, and parse just that section of the Greek. And it was wonderful. Patert, I found it. There it is. He talks in this paragraph about the one will of Jesus. Ha, a pope committing heresy. Oh, wait. As you read further down the paragraph, he starts talking about the two wills of Jesus. Oh. He was talking about, of course, there being two wills of Jesus, but that one will was operating, as in, not my will, but thy will be done. That's orthodox. And I remember that night, sitting up on my roof overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, watching the sunset go down over the bay, and kind of seeing my career going way down with it, because I figured if that's the best that 2,000 years of debate, 500 years of Protestants looking for everything that they could throw at the church, and this is it, I'm in trouble. And so I think it was really at that point that it came crumbling down, because if the papacy is legitimate, then everything else falls into place.